Hey guys, tonight we're turning back time, stepping into the marble corridors of ancient Alexandria, where oil lamps flicker against walls etched with gods, but also hide the darkest secrets you can't even begin to imagine. Right now, you're standing before the doorway into the story of Arsinoe II, a beautiful princess turned into a tool of power by her own father. From girlhood, she learned a horrific lesson. In the Ptolemaic court, survival meant accepting the most repulsive of truths. And if you think you've grown used to tragedy, let me be honest, you wouldn't survive this, not even in tonight's imagination. This is a grim old tale about a woman who was raped by her father, forced to become a queen and stepmother, and ultimately reshaped herself into a symbol of power no one dared defy. A story where power, violence, and corruption twist together like a suffocating web. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, because I bet that no matter the time zone, the whispers from Alexandria will still send chills down your spine. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The marble walls are waiting for us to uncover their secrets. Close your eyes and imagine your feet stepping onto the cold stone floor of the Palace of Alexandria, where the flickering oil lamps cast shimmering light upon mosaic walls of the goddess Isis clutching Osiris. A sacred scene, or at least one made to look sacred, to mask secrets so dark you'd want to dive under the covers after hearing them. You're listening to the story of Arsinoe II, a princess born amidst one of the most chaotic periods in the Mediterranean. Her father, Ptolemy I, was once a trusted general of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, the empire shattered like a broken mirror, and his generals carved up the territories. Everyone claimed to preserve peace, but in truth, it was just an ancient version of a power game. The official event that all historical records agree on: after seizing Egypt, Ptolemy I established a new dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and he decided that if he wanted to rule like a pharaoh, he would have to imitate the pharaohs entirely, including marrying his own daughter. Historians still debate fiercely today. Did Ptolemy truly believe he was a divine incarnation, or was it just an excuse to commit the unthinkable? Whatever the truth, for Arsinoe II, it was no different than hell dressed in marble. Imagine this: while still a young girl, the palace trained her into a political instrument. Math in the morning, Greek language at noon, facial reading by night, to learn who was plotting betrayal. But no curriculum ever prepared her for the gaze of her father, the one who would later turn her into a sacred symbol of power. A little-known fact: in ancient Egypt, father-daughter marriages were not common, even though sibling marriages had precedence among pharaohs. Ptolemy violated not only Greek norms but even forced the priesthood to convene emergency councils to fabricate a myth that this was the divine union of Isis and Osiris. Just imagine an entire religious apparatus constructed to justify one man's action. Sounds eerily like some modern-day headlines, doesn't it? After that strange marriage, Arsinoe II was sent to Thrace to marry Lysimachus, an old general decades her senior, simply because her father wanted to secure an alliance. If you've ever complained about being pushed into matchmaking, congratulations, at least you weren't shipped off to another country to marry a battle-hardened old man. As if life in Thrace wasn't already a form of torment, fate seemed determined to test how much more she could endure. After Lysimachus died in battle in 281 BCE, Arsinoe fled to Cassandreia with her young children and a shred of hope for refuge. But you know, in those times, family wasn't a place of safety. It was just another piece on a massive chessboard. She chose to remarry her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus, to keep the throne. Many people back then shook their heads. If you marry someone known for cruelty, don't be surprised when he turns on your children. And true enough, within months, he killed all of Arsinoe's sons to eliminate rivals to the throne. Take a slow breath and try to digest this detail. Her youngest child was too young to understand what rebellion even meant, yet was still seen as a threat. In that moment, Arsinoe grasped more deeply than ever a bitter truth. In the world of the powerful, love is always the fatal weakness. When she returned to Egypt, she was no longer the woman who dreamed of a family. She had memorized the law of survival. To endure, you must control everything. So she did the unthinkable and shocked the entire Alexandrian court. She forced Ptolemy II, her full brother, to divorce his wife and marry her. If you're thinking, oh my God, then yes, that's exactly what the historians said too. From that moment, Arsinoe II wasn't just a queen in name, she held real power. She organized elaborate ceremonies to glorify incestuous marriage, turned it into a divine standard, and created hundreds of rituals worshiping herself and her brother as living gods. Perhaps the most terrifying thing wasn't the violence, but the way she taught society to believe this was righteous. Every new temple, every sacrificial rite, every chant repeated the same message. Bloodline marriage is a divine proof, a guarantee of prosperity. Close your eyes again and picture the common people quietly offering tributes, whispering prayers, their hearts clenched because they could no longer tell what was sacred and what was fear. And here's what historians still debate today. Was Arsinoe a helpless victim, or did she transform her own tragedy into a ruling instrument, seeding disaster for the entire dynasty? If you feel a chill crawling up your spine, know that it's a normal reaction, because this story isn't just about a queen. It's a reminder that when absolute power goes unchecked, it doesn't stop at destroying individuals, it unravels the very fabric of what we call normal. Take another deep breath. Let the cold of this story settle in your chest, then let your imagination carry you deeper through those marble corridors, where the footprints of Arsinoe II are etched, leaving behind a legacy no one can erase. After transforming herself into a living goddess beside her own brother, she didn't stop at the throne. You can imagine, while everyone else was still reeling from the shock of the bizarre marriage, Arsinoe was already building a new network of power. A network rooted not only in politics, but woven deeply into the spiritual life of the entire kingdom. The official event recorded by both Greek and Egyptian sources, she had temples built in honor of herself and Ptolemy II, commanding the people to call them Theoia Delphoi, divine siblings. Every day, rituals were held, not only to praise ancient gods like Isis and Osiris, but to bless this new incestuous union. Imagine a calloused-handed farmer, bowing low to offer his tribute, muttering prayers for good weather, but deep inside, not daring to think, something isn't right. A little-known fact. It was Arsinoe II who laid the foundation for the extreme incestuous policies that persisted for 3 centuries, leading to the last rulers becoming mentally unstable, perverse, or simply too weak to rule. If you've heard of Cleopatra VII, the legendary final queen of this dynasty, then know that in her veins still ran the twisted legacy of centuries of inbreeding. Think about it. A single decision by Arsinoe forever altered the fate of one of the most powerful dynasties of the Mediterranean. You might wonder, why didn't anyone oppose it? Historians still argue some believe society had become too accustomed to deifying royalty. Others say the fear of the court was too overwhelming for anyone to speak out. Gradually, this style of rule, blending divine authority, violence, and psychological manipulation, sank deep into the roots of Ptolemaic Egypt. Once Arsinoe proved that evil could wear sacred robes, the generations that followed simply repeated the pattern without shame. Take a slow breath and imagine the palace of Alexandria at that time. Every night, extravagant feasts unfolded under oil lamps and the scent of burning resin. Musicians played the lyre, slaves served fine wine, and marble statues of Arsinoe and her brother loomed overhead. Perhaps in those moments, young officials and ambitious generals slowly absorbed a message. All moral standards can be bent, so long as they serve power. A little joke to help you breathe easier. If you find company meetings exhausting, at least your boss doesn't make the whole office erect a statue to celebrate his marriage to his sister, right? But behind the rituals and festivals, the truth was that ordinary Egyptians began to buckle under the tax burden. New temples, new statues, new rituals, all required money. Farmers and merchants were taxed in silver, in grain, just to fund the living gods' banquets and military campaigns. Because Arsinoe didn't just crave domestic power, she yearned to expand the borders. Picture this. In 274 BCE, Egypt launched the first Syrian war against Antiochus I. It was Arsinoe who persuaded Ptolemy II to go to war. The campaign helped Egypt seize some territories, but also set a precedent for immense spending, slowly draining the royal treasury. An interesting piece of information, which you might not have heard, is that even after death, Arsinoe II didn't disappear from politics. Her name was stamped on coins, her temples continued to be built, and later kings would adopt the title Child of Arsinoe to assert their legitimacy. Think about it, a woman who went from victim to ruler, to divine symbol, and finally turned an entire dynasty into a long-running tragedy. If you're lying in bed listening to this story, you might be wondering, did she ever feel regret? Ancient records only describe her as chillingly cold. No one ever saw her shed tears for the children she lost, or for the people she had executed. Perhaps what sends the deepest shiver isn't the poisonings or the incestuous marriage, but her absolute lack of emotion. As if human morals were merely a thin veil, one she had torn long ago and never bothered to mend. Exhale slowly and remind yourself, absolute power is never free. It demands a price, sometimes your very humanity. And if you're still awake, smile softly, because at least, when you fold your blanket and sleep, you won't wake up tomorrow worried about being hauled off to build a temple for your boss. That's a relief, isn't it? But she wasn't only infamous for her marriage to her brother. For a long time, Arsinoe II was also suspected of having had an unusually close relationship with her own father, King Ptolemy I, founder of the mighty Ptolemaic dynasty. You might ask, wait, is this really true, or just slander? And yes, historians still fiercely debate this. Some Roman and later Greek sources, who generally disliked the Egyptian court, hinted that Ptolemy I not only used his daughter as a political tool, but also claimed her to assert his power and divinity. They recounted that in secret religious rituals, father and daughter would appear together as the god Osiris and the goddess Isis, the sacred husband-wife pair, blurring the lines of parent and child. Imagine it, a girl barely in her teens, raised among stone carvings of gods embracing, then forced to don ritual robes, kneel beside her father, and listen to priests chant praises of a divine union. If you feel a chill, that's a perfectly normal reaction. But some modern historians argue this story may have been exaggerated or invented to discredit the Ptolemaic dynasty, since the Romans often portrayed Eastern rulers as depraved. They point out there's no official record of a father-daughter wedding, and that such claims only appear in anonymous accounts generations later. Still, the fact that this rumor endured for centuries reflects one thing. The royal power of the Ptolemies was so terrifying that the people believed they were capable of anything, even crossing the boundaries of humanity itself. A little-known fact, Arsinoe was raised in isolation, not only for her safety, but to be trained for a divine role. From a very young age, she was dressed in white ceremonial robes, crowned with a golden diadem, and taught to walk beside her father as a feminine replica of power. Whether or not their relationship went as far as the physical, the education alone turned her childhood into a stage where faith and fear became one. Exhale slowly, and ask yourself, if you were raised like that, would you still know how to love and trust? Or would you become someone who believes every relationship is merely a tool? A light joke to ease the tension. Compared to this drama, modern palace intrigue television series still sound like children's cartoons. Whether true or not, the suspicion of a father-daughter relationship haunted Arsinoe's image for centuries. It made people view her every decision, from marrying her brother to self-deifying, as the repetition of a tragic script. When the boundaries between family and power collapse once, there's nothing left to stop them from collapsing forever. After marrying her brother, Arsinoe II didn't stop at the title of queen. She transformed the entire court into a theater, with herself as the leading actress and the entire populace as unwilling spectators. In grand ceremonies, people wore lotus garlands, burned fragrant incense, and recited hundreds of hymns to the divine couple, all while knowing in their hearts, this was blasphemy wrapped in gold. A rarely noticed detail. Even Egyptian priests themselves didn't truly believe the marriage was sacred, but they knew that to speak out meant their heads might roll down the palace steps the next morning. So they stayed silent, adding another layer of complicity to seal the truth. Imagine, if you were a taxed farmer forced to fund festivals honoring pure bloodlines, what would you think? Perhaps nothing, because when fear grows large enough, doubt disappears. Official historical records state clearly, during her brief period at the height of power, Egypt entered an era of massive spending temples for Arsinoe, coins with her image, funding for the Syrian war to display might. Though costly, these projects planted a new idea in the public mind, that the throne and divinity were now separated by just a single strand of hair, a strand that Arsinoe had cut herself. Close your eyes gently and ask, if as a child she was truly abused by her father, turned into a divine object, then perhaps her whole life was spent chasing absolute control, so she would never again feel weak. Historians still debate. Some say she was a victim, more to be pitied than blamed. Others call her the architect of the dynasty's downfall. But perhaps the truth lies in both, because no one walks through hell and comes out whole. After marrying Ptolemy II, Arsinoe II became a queen with real power, directing everything from military to diplomacy. Some Greek historians recorded that she personally presided over trials of those who questioned the legitimacy of the marriage, and most of them vanished permanently from the record. Take a slow breath and picture it. In that cold stone chamber, she sits still, her hand resting on the golden armrest, her gaze void of emotion. Perhaps that was the moment she truly became the very thing she had always hated, a hunter of souls, feeding her power with the lives of others. Another light joke to help you shake off the chill. Compared to her, most characters in court dramas would probably need to enroll in advanced training. At the time, Egypt remained one of the wealthiest nations in the Mediterranean, but that prosperity was like a layer of guilt on cracked stone. Just a gentle touch would cause it to crumble, revealing the fissures beneath. The continuous wars, especially the Syrian wars, drained the treasury. The people bent under pressure, merchants paid layer upon layer of taxes, while divine rituals stretched on endlessly. A strange fact, after Arsinoe's death, Ptolemy II continued the rituals worshipping her as a goddess. For years, Egyptian coins still bore the faces of the two siblings, a final confirmation that the legacy of incest had become an unwritten law. Think about it. From a young girl turned into a divine commodity by her father, Arsinoe transformed an entire nation into her own empire, a place where shame was called sacred and fear became tradition. If you're wondering, so what was the final consequence? Perhaps the clearest answer lies in Cleopatra, the last descendant, inheritor of 300 years of intertwined power, incest, and delusion. By her time, the empire was nothing more than a decayed shadow of former glory. You see, although Arsinoe II left no children with Ptolemy II, their marriage set a dangerous precedent. Incestuous marriage became a political standard, no longer an exception. The heir to the throne after Ptolemy II was Ptolemy III Euergetes, son of his first wife Arsinoe, the woman who was deposed and exiled to make way for Arsinoe II. If this sounds like an endless family tragedy stretched over many episodes, you're right, and we haven't even reached the climax yet. After Ptolemy III, the dynasty entered a period in which each successive ruler continued the tradition of incest. Ptolemy IV Philopator married his sister, Arsinoe III. Ptolemy V Epiphanes, their son, ascended the throne at age 5, in a court riddled with deadly conspiracies. Then Ptolemy VI Philometor married his sister Cleopatra II. Imagine, for over 200 years, in each generation, marrying one's sister became an expected rite, justified by speeches glorifying the divine bloodline. A little-known fact, even when Rome began to infiltrate Egypt, the Ptolemaic rulers stubbornly clung to incestuous customs, believing them to be indisputable proof of their divine right to rule. If you're asking, didn't they realize this was a terrible idea? The answer is, when you call something holy for long enough, even you start to believe it. A light joke, if your family gatherings have ever been awkward, at least no one argued whether marrying your sibling was a national duty. But the consequences weren't just moral. Generations began to accumulate biological damage. Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, known as Physcon, the Fat One, was famously cruel and erratic, to the point that historians describe him dining at banquets while killing relatives he suspected of betrayal. From his reign onward, rulers increasingly displayed signs of mental instability, emotional volatility, and a declining capacity to govern. Modern historians debate fiercely. Was the dynasty's collapse due to poor diplomacy, or was it the result of prolonged inbreeding that left them unfit to rule? Picture a court where sacred rituals and family relationships were so intertwined, no one could tell what was real and what was theater. And then came the final generation, Cleopatra VII, the most famous woman of her lineage. She not only inherited the incestuous bloodline, but also bore the full weight of a crumbling political legacy. Cleopatra married two of her younger brothers in succession, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, as a way to maintain the divine tradition. 1. Exhale slowly, because when you see the whole picture, you'll realize Arsinoe II planted a single seed, the belief that any norm could be bent in the name of divine authority, and that seed grew into a poisonous tree that cast a shadow over 3 centuries. An interesting note, even though Cleopatra was one of the most intelligent women of her time, she never dared to fully break with the incest tradition. Even on the final coins of the dynasty, she appeared beside her brother husband to prove her legitimate right to rule. If you're still awake, you might feel a mix of sorrow and horror. Sorrow for the children born into a fate they never chose. Horror at how long a single misguided idea can endure. You exhale gently, letting the chill of the Ptolemaic dynasty settle. But then, as you reflect longer, you'll realize Egypt wasn't the only civilization to turn family into a political chessboard, where incestuous marriages were praised as divine duty. If you think only Alexandria dared such things, let me take you a little further, to Greece, Persia, and even medieval Europe. Imagine, in Achaemenid Persia, kings also married their sisters to preserve bloodline purity. Darius III, the last king before Alexander the Great's conquest, married his own sister, and it wasn't considered sinful, but rather a way to protect the sacred purity of the royal line. A lesser-known detail. The Persians believed that the royal family carried the phara, the divine light of the gods, and that marrying outside the family would contaminate that light. Take a slow breath, then smile, because it seems every civilization had its own way of convincing its people that incest was a noble duty. Then you pass through Hellenistic Greece, where many successor kingdoms of Alexander, the Seleucids, the Antigonids, also borrowed the Egyptian spirit to legitimize intra-family marriages. Though not as widespread as in Alexandria, historian Polybius recorded several close-kin unions used to consolidate power, especially during disputes over the throne. Historians still debate, was the influence of the Ptolemies so overwhelming that Greek courts were swept up in the trend of preserving bloodlines, or was it simply a political tactic in a time of chaos? Picture a royal banquet, monarchs discussing alliances, ending with a marriage proposal to a first cousin. A light joke, compared to that, your company's year-end party still seems pretty wholesome. If you think this only happened in ancient times, I'm sorry to say, medieval Europe wasn't much different. In Spain and Portugal, the Habsburg dynasties were notoriously infamous for generations of inbreeding, not necessarily between siblings, but often between uncles and nieces, or very close cousins. Charles II of Spain, the final descendant of this line, suffered such severe genetic defects that historians called him the king without a dynasty, as he could barely form a sentence and had no heirs. Modern scholars refer to this as the Habsburg syndrome, a tragic demonstration of prioritizing politics over genetics. Take another breath and reflect. Any dynasty that fears losing power will twist morality and even biology just to keep the throne. Even in ancient Japan, the Yamato royal family occasionally practiced consanguineous marriage, though rarely, sometimes marrying cousins to preserve the divine bloodline of Amaterasu. An intriguing detail, in ancient Peru, the Inca Empire also considered sibling marriage a way to maintain divinity. Emperor Atahualpa, the last before the Spanish conquest, was the child of a full sibling union, as they believed the king was a direct descendant of the sun god. You see, from Egypt, Persia, and the Incas to Spain, the fear of losing power always gave rise to justification. Each civilization wrapped it in a different mythological robe, but the outcome was the same, a legacy of disorder and genetic tragedy. A light joke to help you breathe. If you've ever been embarrassed by a complicated family tree, rest easy. At least yours doesn't require a three-tier diagram to explain who married whom. And perhaps, after hearing all these stories, you'll understand. Absolute power not only corrupts reason, it makes people convince themselves that every boundary is worth breaking. If you're still awake, take one more deep breath, because you followed me through palaces, temples, and thrones that were, in truth, the graves of entire dynasties. You gently close your eyes, letting the story settle, but deep in your imagination, the thrones and dynasties still linger. Because if you stare long enough into history, you'll notice something strange. Every seemingly eternal empire carried within it a silent disease, what the ancients called fate, but what we now recognize as the legacy of unrestrained ambition. Picture this. After Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II established the model of sacred marriage, the following Ptolemaic kings no longer questioned it. They married sisters, brothers, nieces, and didn't even bother making excuses. Each reign only needed to mint a coin with the image of the divine couple to remind the people that resistance was pointless. By then, perhaps no one had the courage to ask what was right or wrong. People simply bowed and paid taxes to fund incestuous weddings, new temples, and endless wars. A little-known fact, Ptolemy IV Philopator, a later ruler in Arsinoe's line, was so enamored with ritual that he ordered temples specifically to glorify the love between him and his sister-wife. The Greeks of the time, proud of their civilization, looked at Egypt with a mix of scorn and dread. Take a slow breath and ask yourself, if you were a citizen back then, would you believe or would you tremble? Most likely, the latter, because opposition meant committing sacrilege. And then, generation by generation, the consequences weren't just weak children. They eroded the court's ability to recognize true threats. The Ptolemaic Empire, once a force across the Mediterranean, by Cleopatra VII's time, had become a fragile toy on Rome's chessboard. Imagine this: Cleopatra, the final heir of that bloodline, could not escape the incestuous legacy. She married two younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, to maintain divine authority. And those marriages turned the Alexandrian court into a labyrinth of jealousy, suspicion, and betrayal. Historians still argue, did Cleopatra truly love Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, or were they her final moves to salvage a throne already rotting from within? Imagine the final night when Alexandria burned, the greatest library in the world reduced to ash. In the red glow of the fire, coins bearing the image of the divine siblings melted away. That was the fated moment. 300 years of incestuous marriage and illusions of immortality ending in dust. A light joke: if future generations were to write a play, they'd have to label it maximum grade tragicomedy, because no one could imagine a story both so glorious and so catastrophic. Take a deep breath, then think further. The Ptolemaic Egypt wasn't the only dynasty to forget its limits. The Habsburgs in Spain paid the price with a pitiful king, Charles II, who could barely speak a full sentence. The Inca Empire, with its sibling marriages, crumbled quickly before the small army of Francisco Pizarro. And in medieval Europe, countless noble houses married relatives to hold on to land, only to produce sickly lords and endless feuds. Perhaps, if you're still awake tonight, you'll see this story isn't so unfamiliar. Because the obsession with control, the fear of losing power, and the delusion of pure bloodlines, they always reappear in new forms. A rarely noted fact: when Rome officially made Egypt a colony, they tried to erase all incestuous rituals. But among the people, legends of divine couples continued to circulate for generations, a legacy both shameful and haunting. Close your eyes gently and picture yourself standing on the balcony of a pristine white palace in Alexandria. The Mediterranean wind runs through your hair, carrying the scent of salt and burning resin. Below, the port bustles with ships from every corner of the world: Rome, Carthage, Athens. But on the marble steps, a child is learning to walk like a goddess, though in truth, her heart is just that of a 10-year-old girl longing for a kind embrace. That girl is Cleopatra's seventh Philopator, the final heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a bloodline that began with Alexander the Great, sustained by power and incest. If you ask why a child born with everything gold, a throne, the title of living goddess, had to learn to hide her fear, the answer lies in her family's history. 300 years earlier, Arsinoe too had set the rule: pure blood is the ultimate claim to rule. Since that day, every Ptolemaic prince and princess grew up knowing that one day they would marry a sibling, cousin, or niece to protect the throne. And if you think that sounds unbelievable, remember, Cleopatra VII was the final product of those marriages. One fact rarely mentioned: she had at least two younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Both became her ceremonial husbands. For Cleopatra, this was far from romantic. It was a political ritual, a formality required to silence the court and keep the people bowed. Take a breath and imagine, a girl who hadn't yet finished learning classical Greek was already expected to look her younger brother in the eye and call him my divine husband. Historians still debate, did Cleopatra, even as a child, accept this fate as inevitable, or did she secretly nurture a will to escape it? Whatever the answer, she soon showed extraordinary brilliance. While earlier Ptolemaic queens were mere decorative goddesses, Cleopatra studied 9 languages, read her own diplomatic papers, managed the treasury, and negotiated directly with Roman envoys. One fascinating detail: Cleopatra was the only Ptolemy who learned and fluently used the Egyptian language. To the people of Alexandria, she was entirely different from the arrogant Greek gods who only demanded tribute. She knew how to step onto the dais, speak in their tongue, and make them believe Isis had returned in the form of a young queen. Picture that scene. Thousands gathered in the square, torches flickering, and a slender girl steps forward, her voice ringing out in ancient Egyptian. In that moment, the crowd forgot, however briefly, that she too was the product of 3 centuries of incest. But power, as you know, is never a free gift. The price Cleopatra paid was a childhood turned into a game of survival. Take a slow breath, and imagine her father, Ptolemy XII, spending his life clinging to the throne by borrowing Roman money, granting tax rights, and pledging loyalty. In Rome's eyes, Egypt was nothing but a ripe prize, and Cleopatra grew up haunted by the truth. Sooner or later, they would devour her homeland. Imagine the final night when Alexandria burned, the greatest library in the world reduced to ash. In the red glow of the fire, coins bearing the image of the divine siblings melted away. That was the fated moment. 300 years of incestuous marriage and illusions of immortality ending in dust. A light joke, if future generations were to write a play, they'd have to label it maximum grade tragicomedy, because no one could imagine a story both so glorious and so catastrophic. Take a deep breath, then think further. The Ptolemaic Egypt wasn't the only dynasty to forget its limits. The Habsburgs in Spain paid the price with a pitiful king, Charles II, who could barely speak a full sentence. The Inca Empire, with its sibling marriages, crumbled quickly before the small army of Francisco Pizarro. And in medieval Europe, countless noble houses married relatives to hold on to land, only to produce sickly lords and endless feuds. Perhaps, if you're still awake tonight, you'll see this story isn't so unfamiliar, because the obsession with control, the fear of losing power, and the delusion of pure bloodlines, they always reappear in new forms. A rarely noted fact, when Rome officially made Egypt a colony, they tried to erase all incestuous rituals. But among the people, legends of divine couples continued to circulate for generations, a legacy both shameful and haunting. Close your eyes gently, and picture yourself standing on the balcony of a pristine white palace in Alexandria. The Mediterranean wind runs through your hair, carrying the scent of salt and burning resin. Below, the port bustles with ships from every corner of the world, Rome, Carthage, Athens. But on the marble steps, a child is learning to walk like a goddess, though in truth, her heart is just that of a 10-year-old girl longing for a kind embrace. That girl is Cleopatra VII Philopator, the final heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a bloodline that began with Alexander the Great, sustained by power and incest. If you ask why a child born with everything, gold, a throne, the title of living goddess, had to learn to hide her fear, the answer lies in her family's history. 300 years earlier, Arsinoe II had set the rule. Pure blood is the ultimate claim to rule. Since that day, every Ptolemaic prince and princess grew up knowing that one day, they would marry a sibling, cousin, or niece to protect the throne. And if you think that sounds unbelievable, remember, Cleopatra VII was the final product of those marriages. One fact rarely mentioned, she had at least 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Both became her ceremonial husbands. For Cleopatra, this was far from romantic. It was a political ritual, a formality required to silence the court and keep the people bowed. Take a breath and imagine, a girl who hadn't yet finished learning classical Greek was already expected to look her younger brother in the eye and call him, "my divine husband." Historians still debate, did Cleopatra, even as a child, accept this fate as inevitable, or did she secretly nurture a will to escape it? Whatever the answer, she soon showed extraordinary brilliance. While earlier Ptolemaic queens were mere decorative goddesses, Cleopatra studied 9 languages, read her own diplomatic papers, managed the treasury, and negotiated directly with Roman envoys. One fascinating detail, Cleopatra was the only Ptolemy who learned and fluently used the Egyptian language. To the people of Alexandria, she was entirely different from the arrogant Greek gods who only demanded tribute. She knew how to step onto the dais, speak in their tongue, and make them believe Isis had returned in the form of a young queen. Picture that scene. Thousands gathered in the square, torches flickering, and a slender girl steps forward, her voice ringing out in ancient Egyptian. In that moment, the crowd forgot, however briefly, that she too was the product of 3 centuries of incest. But power, as you know, is never a free gift. The price Cleopatra paid was a childhood turned into a game of survival. Take a slow breath and imagine her father, Ptolemy XII, spending his life clinging to the throne by borrowing Roman money, granting tax rights, and pledging loyalty. In Rome's eyes, Egypt was nothing but a ripe prize, and Cleopatra grew up haunted by the truth. Sooner or later, they would devour her homeland. A light joke: if you think your college tuition was brutal, try imagining Cleopatra inheriting a national debt so large Rome was ready to send troops to collect it. After the death of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra was only around 18, yet she immediately had to marry her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, to secure the throne. Officially, they co-ruled, but in reality, the court formed factions around the underage boy and began plotting to remove Cleopatra. Imagine a brilliant, fierce young woman forced to sit through court sessions while old men decided her fate simply because she was a woman. Roman historians described her in many ways. Some admired the courageous queen, others scorned her as a cunning woman. But whether they loved or loathed her, they all agreed on one thing: Cleopatra never accepted being a puppet. If you're still awake, take a deep breath, because the story is only beginning. When you're ready, I'll tell you more about the years in exile, the night she met Julius Caesar, and how she turned love into her final weapon to save Egypt from Rome's jaws. But for tonight, let this chapter rest in your imagination, for Cleopatra's childhood alone is enough to show no throne is built on solid ground. They all rise from the swamp of ambition and fear. You gently close your eyes and picture it. The night in Alexandria turns colder than ever, not from sea winds, but from the air inside the palace, thick with betrayal. Cleopatra is only 18 or 19, while her brother Ptolemy XIII is not even of ruling age. But behind him stands an entire entourage of seasoned advisors, men with silver hair, wrinkled faces, and hearts still swollen with ambition. A little-known detail: the leader of the regency was Pothinus, a shrewd eunuch who quickly realized Cleopatra was dangerously intelligent. To Pothinus, a young queen with education and a mind of her own was the greatest threat to the delicate web of power he had spun around the boy king. Imagine sitting in meetings with people constantly seeking to undermine you, where every word and glance could be a blade. Cleopatra learned that lesson early, and she knew time favored the more patient and ruthless players. Roman historians still argue, was it Cleopatra's unflinching confidence that made her so hated? Or simply the fact that she was a woman, and her intelligence was a thorn in the side of those ruling in her brother's name? Exhale gently and picture the scene. Cleopatra, dressed in a purple robe, sits on the queen's chair. Pothinus bows low, his voice as sweet as honey, but his eyes as cold as stone. "Your Majesty, perhaps you should rest. State affairs are not a burden for a woman." A light joke to ease the tension: if you think your coworkers are good at gaslighting, try being a young queen of Egypt surrounded by eunuchs and schemers twice your age. No one knows the exact moment things spiraled beyond control. But by 49 BCE, it was clear. Cleopatra was no longer safe in the palace. The court issued a decree to depose her. Cleopatra's name began disappearing from official records. Loyal supporters were arrested and charged. Step by step, she was pushed to the margins. Imagine one night, Cleopatra slipping away from the palace in silence. No procession, no guards. Just a few loyal friends and a small boat, gliding over the dark waves of the Mediterranean, carrying her towards Syria. That was when the story shifted, from court intrigue to full-blown civil war. An interesting fact: Cleopatra never accepted exile. In Syria, she immediately established a military camp, summoned mercenaries, and rallied loyal remnants. Within months, she had an army ready to march back to Alexandria. Take a deep breath, because here was a girl not yet 20, transforming herself into a general, negotiating with Syrian warlords, bargaining every bag of gold to hire soldiers. Meanwhile, Ptolemy XIII remained in Alexandria, propped up by Pothinus and advisors, playing the role of the legitimate king. Historians still debate: did Cleopatra pursue power out of personal ambition, or did she simply understand too well, if she didn't reclaim the throne, she'd be killed, and Egypt's history would end beneath Rome's feet? Breathe slowly and ask yourself, in her place, would you choose quiet exile or return to face a fratricidal war? A light joke: if your family gatherings feel tense, imagine Cleopatra leading troops against her ceremonial little brother. Throughout that summer, the battle lines held. Ptolemy XIII ordered a blockade on Syrian goods, raised taxes, and launched propaganda calling Cleopatra a blasphemous usurper. But she never wavered. Every diplomatic letter, every coin of gold spent to buy the loyalty of commanders. It was all calculated. Imagine a white tent in the desert, Cleopatra seated on a wooden chair, a map of Egypt spread before her. The night is cold, but the oil lamp in her eyes still burns, the light of someone who vowed not to be erased from history. A detail rarely mentioned. Cleopatra was not only a brilliant diplomat, but personally inspected camps on horseback and rallied her troops. These stories spread among soldiers, turning her into legend while still alive. If you're still awake, take one more deep breath, because the story is just reaching the threshold of its greatest act. For as Cleopatra and her brother battled for control, another force was approaching Alexandria, Julius Caesar, the most powerful general in the world, the man who would forever alter Egypt's fate. Inhale slowly and picture this. Under a misty Alexandria night, a Roman column moves silently through the harbor, the clinking of armor, golden torchlight, and at the center, Caesar on horseback, his eyes cold and calculating, looking at the city like a prize not yet claimed. At that moment, Cleopatra, from her Syrian camp, understood one truth. If she didn't win Caesar's favor, she would lose everything. An interesting detail: Caesar didn't come to Egypt for her, but because of a massive debt owed by Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, to secure his throne. To Rome, Egypt was just an arrogant debtor. To Caesar, it was a matter of honor. His political rival, Pompey, had just been murdered here. Imagine it, a city glowing like an oil lamp about to flicker out, a queen in exile, a Roman general hungry for glory, and a fated night. Historians still argue, who devised that audacious plan, Cleopatra or her advisors? But all agree, without her courage, Egypt's story would have ended here. Breathe slowly and picture it. Cleopatra couldn't enter the palace openly. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors had ordered her arrest on sight. So the story goes that she was smuggled in, hidden inside a Syrian wool rug, wrapped so tightly no one suspected a thing. In the middle of the night, the rug was carried through the gates and laid at Caesar's feet. A light joke: if you ever thought delivery just meant midnight pizza, welcome to the greatest unboxing in history. Imagine that moment. Soldiers pull the rug open, and a young woman rises, black hair cascading over her shoulders, eyes meeting those of the most powerful Roman alive. That was the moment everything changed. Cleopatra didn't bow, didn't beg. She declared herself the rightful queen, daughter of a king allied with Rome, and pleaded with Caesar to be the judge of justice between her and her brother. Take a deep breath. This was not just a power negotiation. It was a dialogue between two exceptional minds, one born to conquer, the other to survive. Roman historians recount, Caesar was deeply impressed, not just by beauty, though Cleopatra was striking, but by her confidence, intellect, and uncommon courage. That very night, he agreed to protect her, a rarely mentioned detail. Caesar, then 52, a seasoned commander, ordered Roman guards to watch over Cleopatra through the night, ensuring no one dared lay a hand on her. Imagine, the next morning, as the Alexandrian court awoke, they found Ptolemy XIII pale, faced learning that his sister was in the palace, and now sitting beside Caesar. A light joke: if you think your cousin is hard to deal with, imagine your little brother finding out you just spent the night negotiating with a Roman general. Ptolemy XIII's shame and fury exploded into flames. He tore off his royal cloak, ran through the city wailing, inciting the people against Caesar. To the crowd, it was a national humiliation, a promiscuous queen dragging a foreign power into their royal dispute. But Caesar didn't back down. He summoned both Cleopatra and her brother to the Alexandrian Great Hall and declared, "I, in the name of the Roman Republic, order both of you to rule jointly. Any threat or violence will be considered treason against Rome." Take a slow breath and consider, for Cleopatra, this was her first victory, but she knew all too well. That victory existed only because a Roman sword now stood beside her throne. A strange fact: in the weeks that followed, Cleopatra and Caesar remained in the royal palace, negotiating politics and becoming lovers. No one knows exactly when the relationship began, but by the time Plutarch recorded it, it was taken as fact. Imagine a night in Alexandria, dim oil lamps, waves lapping gently outside, and in a cold stone chamber, two people plotting how to save a crumbling empire. Historians still debate. Did Cleopatra truly love Caesar, or simply use him as a shield? But it seems Caesar, too, was enchanted not just by her beauty, but by her intellect and ambition. In his heart, only those who dared risk everything were worthy companions. A light joke: if you think dating is complicated, remember, Cleopatra had to manage love, taxation policy, and a civil war all at once. And then, inevitably, violence erupted. The Alexandrian mob rioted. Ptolemy XIII's forces surrounded the palace and cut off supplies. Civil war began. The siege of Alexandria lasted for months, turning into a brutal clash between siblings, one backed by Roman steel, the other driven by a mission to cleanse the throne of blasphemy. Take another breath. This is still just the beginning. Cleopatra, not yet 20, remained deep inside the palace with Julius Caesar. Outside, Ptolemy XIII led the siege, determined to turn the usurper into a hostage. A little-known detail: the siege dragged on for so long that food stores ran out. Roman soldiers had to boil hay for meals, and city residents began rioting from hunger and fear. Imagine, each morning, Cleopatra stepping onto the balcony, staring at the sea, where Ptolemy's warships stretched in formation, blocking all supplies. She knew that if they didn't break the siege, everything would fall. Historians still debate, was it during these desperate days that Caesar resolved to make Cleopatra sole queen, not only to reward her courage, but to ensure Egypt would remain a loyal Roman ally? You smile bitterly, because sometimes, love and power are not so different. A light joke: if you think your family argues a lot, try imagining your little brother laying siege to your palace while you dodge flaming arrows and write diplomatic letters. On the longest night of the siege, Caesar gave the order to set fire to the enemy's fleet to break the blockade. The blaze roared, consuming hundreds of wooden ships, and with them, a large part of the legendary library of Alexandria. Take a deep breath, because that was a tragedy no one expected. The fire that saved Cleopatra also destroyed countless ancient texts, treasures of knowledge lost forever. A strange fact: Cleopatra never left a single word about the burning of the library. Perhaps she understood, in the game of survival, something must always be sacrificed. After months of conflict, Roman reinforcements led by Mithridates of Pergamon approached Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII's army was pushed to the Nile. In the chaos of retreat, Ptolemy XIII, once called the Good King, drowned when his boat capsized. Imagine Cleopatra, hearing that her brother had died, simply stared at the horizon. They say she didn't cry, only murmured. Some are born to rule. Some are born to die for the throne. Historians still debate. Was that a true lament, or simply the way she closed the final chapter of a fratricidal tragedy? A light joke: if you ever thought your siblings were hard to deal with, at least they didn't lay siege to your house and drown trying to run away. After Ptolemy XIII's death, Caesar installed Ptolemy XIV, the youngest brother, about 12 years old, as Cleopatra's nominal co-ruler. But real power had returned to Cleopatra. Take a breath and imagine a new coronation inside Alexandria's Great Hall. Cleopatra in a white robe trimmed with gold, wearing the double crown of Pharaoh, holding the royal scepter. But this time, she shared the throne with no one in truth. A rarely mentioned detail: immediately after her coronation, Cleopatra ordered new coins minted with her and Caesar's faces, a silent message that Egypt and Rome were now allies, and she was the sole queen. Picture it: a girl not yet 21, who had endured exile, civil war, siege, and loss. And yet, when she stood on that throne, her eyes still shone, the gaze of someone who knew that surviving was itself a triumph. Roman historians recorded, during Caesar's stay in Alexandria, he and Cleopatra lived together in the palace. They strolled by the canals, feasted together, and wrote orders to generals. An interesting fact: Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, officially named Ptolemy XV, whom she believed would become the bridge between Egypt and Rome's ultimate power. Breathe slowly, for in that brief moment, Cleopatra seemed to have it all: a protected throne, a son of imperial blood, and love with the most powerful man on earth. But you know, history never pauses long for anyone to enjoy their victories. A light joke: if you think long-distance relationships are exhausting, try loving a Roman general busy conquering Europe and waiting months for a letter to arrive. Then came the day Caesar departed Alexandria to return to Rome. He left behind a small protective garrison and the formal guarantee of alliance. Cleopatra escorted him all the way to the harbor. It is said she shed no tears, only placed a hand on Caesar's shoulder and whispered something no one heard. Historians speculate it was a promise to meet again, to walk into Rome not as a prisoner, but as a queen and ally. Close your eyes and imagine. That night, Alexandria was unusually quiet. For the first time in years, Cleopatra sat alone in a chamber free of threats. But she knew, this victory was only the beginning of a larger game. Take a deep breath and imagine. The Mediterranean Sea stretched before Cleopatra like a vast blue mirror, reflecting ambitions not yet named. On the deck of the ship, she sat among her attendants, fingers brushing the silk robe embroidered with the goddess Isis. In her heart, she knew this journey was unlike any other. Cleopatra was going to Rome. A little-known fact, she did not arrive as a prisoner or an ordinary guest, but as a queen ally and the mother of Caesar's only son. Picture it, early in the year 46 BCE, when the Egyptian fleet entered the Tiber River. Roman citizens poured onto both banks, pointing, whispering. To them, Cleopatra was both a symbol of the exotic East and a silent threat. Your empire is no longer untouchable. Egypt is not merely a vassal. Roman historians still debate. Did Caesar truly love Cleopatra, or use her to fortify his power? But they all agree. The Egyptian queen's presence in Rome sent shockwaves through the Republic. A light joke, if you've ever introduced your partner to your family, imagine introducing the queen of the richest land in the Mediterranean to the Roman Senate. In a grand villa along the Tiber, Cleopatra lived like a true queen. Her entourage brought offerings, perfumes, sweet wines, and even golden lions to decorate her feasts. Meanwhile, Caesar governed the empire, planned his triumphs, and launched reforms. Imagine a spring night, Cleopatra and Caesar sitting on the terrace, watching the torches of Rome stretch to the horizon. Perhaps, in that moment, both believed they could rewrite Egypt's fate. An interesting detail, Cleopatra made no effort to hide the presence of her son Caesarion. She deliberately let the people of Rome see the child as a potential shared heir of two great civilizations. Breathe slowly, because that was an unprecedented boldness. If Caesar acknowledged the boy, the entire political structure of Rome would tremble. But then, as you know, time never grants anyone too many blessings. On the Ides of the 4th of March, 4 BCE, when Caesar walked into the Curia of Pompey for a meeting, he had no idea it would be his final morning. 23 stab wounds from those who once called him friend. Blood soaked his toga, dripping onto the cold marble floor. Breathe deeply, because it was not just the end of a man, but the death knell for all the dreams Cleopatra had pinned on him. Historians still debate, was Cleopatra in Rome at the time? Did she witness it with her own eyes, or did she hear it secondhand from the frantic mouths of her servants? Either way, one thing is certain, the day Caesar died, Egypt lost its strongest shield. A light joke, if you think breakups are painful, try saying goodbye via 23 stab wounds and a collapsing empire. Cleopatra immediately understood. She was no longer safe in Rome. As the Senate split, some labeled her the Eastern Witch, others demanded her and Caesarion's expulsion. Picture it, the final night in the villa by the Tiber, Cleopatra holding her sleeping child, taking one last look at the Roman lights, then boarding a ship back to Alexandria. As the ship pulled away, she knew, from now on, she would have to write her destiny with her own hands. A detail few notice. Just months later, Rome fell into another civil war, as three rising figures, Mark Antony, Octavian, the future Augustus, and Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate to avenge Caesar's assassination. And then fate knocked again, this time in the form of another man, Mark Antony. Exhale slowly, then imagine Alexandria glistening under the sun. Cleopatra sits on the throne, black hair over her shoulders, her gaze calm. But deep inside, the void remained, and the fear that Rome would soon return. Then one day, a messenger arrived. Mark Antony, the famed general, seasoned in battle and infamous for excess, summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus. Historians still debate, did Antony summon her for tribute, or out of curiosity about the woman who had conquered Caesar's heart? Picture it, Cleopatra hearing the summons, only smiling faintly. She felt no fear. On the contrary, she decided to turn this meeting into the most dazzling performance history had ever seen. A light joke, if you think dating apps require effort, imagine preparing a fleet of golden ships and silken canopies just to meet a Roman general. Cleopatra ordered a grand barge painted crimson, with golden masts and sails of purple embroidered with Aphrodite. She sat beneath a silk canopy, robed in silver, crowned as Isis, the living embodiment of the goddess of love. Take a deep breath, because that moment wasn't just an extravagant entrance. It was a declaration. I do not come to beg, I come to conquer. Close your eyes and picture it. The Cydnus River flowing quietly under Tarsus' golden sun, the water a mirror reflecting Egypt's royal fleet gliding slowly forward. On deck, Cleopatra sat motionless, her stillness regal. Her black hair cascading over her shoulders, she fanned herself gently with ostrich feathers. Behind her, attendants dressed as divine nymphs played soft music on bronze instruments. A little-known fact, Cleopatra spent weeks preparing this entrance. She didn't just want to impress Antony, she wanted to etch herself into his memory. Roman historians still debate, was this the greatest PR stunt of the ancient world? But they all agree, no queen had ever entered a Roman general's domain with such command. Breathe slowly, then picture it, the barge docking at shore, Antony standing on the stone steps, momentarily speechless. Before him stood not a trembling hostage, but a smiling Aphrodite. A light joke, if you think preparing for a date takes too long, imagine rehearsing sacred rituals and building golden ships for weeks. Cleopatra descended the steps, her gown brushing the river's edge, and stopped before Antony. No bowing, no hesitation. She spoke in a soft, firm voice. I did not come to apologize. I came to discuss the future of two empires. In that moment, they say Antony was silent. Half wonder, half awe. Historians wrote that Cleopatra knew Antony was obsessed with Alexander the Great, so she carefully invoked the legacy of Macedon, awakening both his pride and a sense of historical destiny. Exhale, for this was not just a meeting, but a collision between ambition and courage, between a brilliant woman and a power-hungry man. After that reception, Cleopatra invited Antony to a banquet aboard her ship. The table was adorned with roses, silver lamps, and Egyptian honey wine in crystal jars. Her handmaidens danced and sang hymns to Isis, the goddess who blesses those bold enough to risk everything for love and power. A lesser-known fact, Antony, though infamous for his Roman debauchery, later admitted he had never experienced anything quite like that night. Picture them seated across from each other, two people fully aware that this was not merely passion, but a political alliance wrapped in soft silk. A light joke, if you think you've ever had a serious crush, imagine being so smitten you'd spark a war over someone. In the days that followed, Cleopatra did not return immediately to Alexandria. She remained in Tarsus for several weeks, feasting and negotiating. Antony needed gold to fund his Syrian campaign. Cleopatra needed Roman protection for her throne, and the recognition of Caesarion as heir. Historians still debate, who truly fell first, Antony or Cleopatra? But few deny that their relationship soon became open and undeniable. Breathe slowly, for from that moment on, the fates of Egypt and Rome began to intertwine. After several weeks, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, but now, she was no longer a solitary queen. Behind her stood the quiet backing of a Roman general battling for control of the empire. An interesting note, when Cleopatra departed Tarsus, Antony promised to visit Alexandria soon. To her, it was both a declaration of affection and a guarantee of safety. Picture it, a golden ship sailing down the coast of Syria, purple sails fluttering, Cleopatra on deck, her fingers tracing the lines of the latest Roman map. In her mind, this was not merely about a heart, but about defending Egypt at all costs. A light joke, if you think long-distance love is hard, try falling for a general busy commanding armies across the Mediterranean. And as promised, Antony soon arrived in Alexandria, not as a Roman governor demanding tribute, but as an honored guest. Exhale and imagine, feast stretching over many nights, wine flowing like rivers, and the city lit up in some of the most extravagant celebrations in Ptolemaic history. Antony was swept into the Eastern world where Cleopatra was goddess, ally, and unmatched lover. Historians recorded, Antony began dressing in Greek robes, participating in Isis rituals, even learning phrases in Egyptian to please her. Take another breath, for this was the beginning of a love that would not only break hearts, but shatter empires. If you're still awake, tomorrow night I'll tell you how that love became Rome's excuse for war, and the final tragedy, when Alexandria fell beneath Augustus' feet. But now, close your eyes, inhale slowly, and let the story rest in your imagination, for by now, you understand, some encounters reshape the fate of the world. Picture it, Alexandria more radiant than ever, torches lighting up the white stone colonnades, their flames dancing on the crystalline surface of the sea. There, Cleopatra and Mark Antony lived days that felt untouchable, a divine couple, in love, dreaming of dominion over the Mediterranean. A lesser-known fact, Antony moved fully to Alexandria, spending most of his time with Cleopatra, rather than in Rome, prompting the Senate to view him as a traitor drowned in Eastern luxury. Jazen, Historians still debate, was Antony truly so enchanted he forgot Rome's power? Or was he wagering everything on a union strong enough to outmatch Octavian? Breathe slowly, and imagine endless banquets in Alexandria's palace. Fresh grapes, honeyed wine, silver lamps hanging high. Antony in Greek robes, Cleopatra in silk embroidered with Isis. To the Egyptian people, they were not merely king and queen, they were living gods. A light joke: if you think moving in with someone is a big step, Antony moved in with Cleopatra and brought his career, reputation, and fate along. But as you know, no love ever survives untouched by politics. Octavian Caesar's adopted son was waiting in Rome. He was cunning, patient, and understood one simple truth. The Roman people hated the idea of Antony turning Egypt into a new center of power. An interesting fact: Octavian launched a smear campaign against Cleopatra, painting her as an Eastern sorceress who seduced Antony and drove him to betray his homeland. Imagine statues of Cleopatra quietly smashed in Roman streets, whispers spreading through taverns. He plans to hand the entire Roman Empire to a woman. Historians recount, in response, Antony and Cleopatra hosted the donations of Alexandria. At this grand ceremony, Antony divided vast eastern territories among her children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings. Their twin children, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were named rulers of Syria and Cyrenaica. Breathe slowly, for this was the final straw. To Octavian, it was proof that Antony had lost his mind and betrayed Rome. A light joke: if you think your boyfriend gives grand birthday gifts, imagine being handed entire nations. In 32 BCE, Octavian convinced the Roman Senate to declare war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. A brilliant move. He reframed a power struggle as a war to protect Rome from the east. Take a deep breath. From that moment on, Cleopatra knew there was no turning back. Historians debate. Did she urge Antony to return to Rome and reconcile with Octavian? Or did she too believe they were strong enough to defeat him? Whatever the truth, the combined Egyptian-Roman fleet of Antony set sail for Actium. Picture it, the 31st of September, BCE. Over 500 ships stretched across the horizon, wind-swelling purple sails. Cleopatra aboard the largest galley, golden masts, silver lanterns hanging from the railings. A little-known fact: she directly oversaw logistics and supply lines, not merely a queen in attendance. But you already know, the Battle of Actium was a disaster. The winds turned. Antony's fleet fell into chaos. When Cleopatra saw the lines breaking, she ordered her ships to withdraw. Antony, seeing her sails retreat, panicked and turned his ship to follow. A light joke: if you think breakups are shocking, imagine being in battle and your lover sails away first. After Actium, everything collapsed. Octavian marched swiftly toward Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra returned to the palace, once a place of love, now a fortress of despair. Breathe slowly and imagine those final nights. Cleopatra in a white robe, staring at the Black Sea. Antony drinking himself numb, asking from time to time, "If I hadn't turned my ship." But history doesn't care for what if. A heartbreaking detail. In desperation, Antony still ordered the remnants of his army to regroup, though he knew they stood no chance. Cleopatra secretly sent envoys to negotiate with Octavian, offering to cede the throne to her son, Caesarion, in exchange for safety. Octavian refused. He intended to end the Ptolemaic dynasty forever. Breathe deeply and picture the fateful morning. Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had taken her own life. In despair, he drew his sword and stabbed himself, but the wound didn't kill him instantly. When soldiers told Cleopatra, she screamed and ordered him brought to her. They say he died in her arms, his lips still bloodied, whispering his final words: "I am not defeated if you are alive." Exhale, for that moment was not just the tragedy of two lovers, but the end of an entire age. A light joke: if you ever thought love could be dramatic, this is history's most heartbreak-rich romance. The next day, Cleopatra locked herself inside her mausoleum. She dressed in her royal gown, adorned herself with the last of her jewelry. When Octavian's men broke in, she was already gone. Historians still debate, did she use a poisoned asp or was she assassinated? But all sources agree, Cleopatra refused to be paraded as a trophy in Octavian's triumph. Take one more breath for tonight. You have heard the full story. 300 years of the Ptolemaic dynasty, ending beneath the black hair of a woman who dared to love to the very end. If you're still awake, Close your eyes and remember one thing. Every empire, no matter how dazzling, begins with an ambition and ends because of another. And sometimes, the human heart is a battlefield fiercer than any war.